In Rise of Kingdoms, I'm sure when you think of building a Murderball, you think just watching videos and copying whatever commanders people say are best. And yes, that can work, and of course I've made videos like that before, but in today's video, I'm going to break down the principles of building a Murderball. What do you need inside that Murderball for it to be actually good, so that you can make decisions based on commanders you may have that others may not. I'll talk about what makes a good Murderball, my recommendations of structuring a Murderball, and what commander types a Murderball must include, and there are 3 types in there. So if you want some examples of these commanders, and maybe you just want to know how to build a proper Murderball from the commanders you already own, you want to stick around till the end of the video. Now let's just start off by asking the question of what makes a good Murderball, and I think this is a relatively easy question to answer on the surface, and it is a good Murderball is just a group of marchers that can trade well even by themselves, so you're not reliant on having other people around you at all times. Of course, in some open field situations, even most open field situations, you will be with other people who are helping you fight, but if we be realistic, there are some game modes out there, for example Ark of Osiris or Champions of Olympia, and even moments in your KVK when you're going to need your Murderball to pretty much be self-sustaining. So I think a Murderball that is not reliant on other people, that can still trade good even if it's not in another massive Murderball situation, is what makes a good Murderball, because maybe you're in a smaller fight, maybe you're in your downtime, maybe you're in those game modes I mentioned before. So in those situations, you want your Murderball to be self-reliant, you want it to be able to sustain itself and do the damage and get the debuffs you want out of the commanders that you have access to. I also think that really simply a good Murderball will trade good in most situations, which would be fairly obvious if you do think about it. So a good Murderball, in my opinion, is very simply a Murderball that can trade well at all times and is able to sustain itself and is not reliant on another player or on other marchers that you may not have access to, because it's not a reliable way. So a good Murderball, in the simplest answer, is a reliable, decent trading Murderball. Now the next thing I would like to talk about is my recommendation on the structuring of your commanders, and that really means how many marchers do I recommend? How many marchers should you have in your Murderball? And I have a really simple rule for this. You want to have the least number of marchers possible with the strongest number of commanders you can have. That's my simple answer of what you want with your number of marchers. I recommend for every single player, instead of going for a 7 march Murderball with 14 average commanders, you go for a 3 march Murderball with even just 5 or 6 really good commanders, rather than that massive Murderball with less commanders, because unless you're farming 24/7, you are going to need to use your resources wisely. You're going to need to save your speed ups, especially if you're in a big KVK and you're trying to get as many kills as possible. So going for lower marches but also stronger marches is just going to be better for you. And I usually recommend for every single player, somewhere in the realm of 3 marches is best, because when I get into the types of commanders you want to use, you'll notice there are 3 types, and within a 3 march Murderball, you can usually create what I said was a good Murderball, a self-sustaining, reliable Murderball that gets good trade. So to do that, you want to have good commanders, you want to have meta commanders who are able to perform pretty good. And I think the real best spot for a free-to-play low spender is to have a 3 march Murderball. When you get to 4 marches and 5 marches, even if you have really good commanders, you'll notice that it can still struggle in some situations if you aren't either really good at playing the game, and also you'll notice that when I get into the types of commanders you want, the best realm to really be is either 3 marches or 6 marches, which is where you can have access to one of each type of commander. So you'll notice that I recommend really 3 marches is the best number of marches. I personally will only be running 3 marches, and if you currently have only got like 2 or 3 marches for your Murderball, just work on those marches, make them as strong as possible, and don't really bother adding any extra marches. I always have people come into my stream who are like, I'm currently running 2 double expertise marches and I want to add a third one with only 5/5/1/1 commanders, I just usually don't recommend it. It's not a very good idea. Or some people come in like, I could split up my CPO and I can put in with a Mehmed and I can put my Guan with a Sargon at like 5511 and I can make a March out of that. Yes, you can, but it's just not going to trade that good. So really, you're going for the quality over the quantity here to make your Murderball really as strong as possible, and that's how I'd structure it. I'd structure it 3 of your strongest marches with the 3 commander types that I'll talk about now. So now let's get into those 3 commander types that I was talking about, and I'm going to tell you what the commander type is, what the commander type does, and when you should unlock them, and I'll give you some examples. And first up, the most important commander march you can have is a DPS March. This March is really here to get you the bulk of your kills. It's going to get your best trades. It's going to deal the most damage. And it's also going to be the first March you unlock and the first March you double expertise, because your DPS March, or your damage March, is really simply going to be the March that receives the most attention. And it's just because that March is what's there to get you the kills. It's there to shred your enemies. And if people ignore that March, it's going to get ridiculously good trades. Some examples include Zulang with Herman Prime. This is a DPS March for archers. For cavalry, I think really simply, you've currently got Nevsky and Joan, but I think there'll be some more commanders coming out soon who might change that. And then for infantry, you've got a CPO with Lao Che as your DPS March. These DPS marches often tend to be a little bit less tanky. I mean, Nevsky with Joan and CPO can be slightly tanky, but they're not as tanky as other commanders out there, and they can get shredded pretty quickly, especially the Nevsky Joan. I've seen some of those things melt pretty quick. Even though Nevsky is, in some ways, a little bit of a defensive commander, he can still go down pretty fast. And then, of course, Yulang with Herman will also go down extremely quickly if you aren't being able to really manage the march well and focusing on it. So you want to make your DPS march the strongest march you own. You want to give it your best equipment, especially. You'll notice my Zulang has currently got my best gear on. You'll also want to give it your best armaments, and you want to go for the DPS stuff. So for example, here I'm running the wedge formation, and I'm running a bunch of powerful inscriptions on it. So my best inscription, the hunter inscription, is on my Zulang March. My best gear is on my Zulang March. And I'm running a very, very much damage-oriented talented build. I don't really care too much about the tankiness. I'm more in there for the damage, just to deal as much damage as possible, and this March is going to be the March I focus my whole entire Murderball around. Whenever this March gets low, even if my other marches are still high on troops, I'm going back to my city to refresh my Murderball, because the DPS March is, like I said, your most important. If your DPS March gets low, your whole Murderball's trades just go down, because you're missing out on stuff such as AoE value, especially if you're running a Zulang and a Herman and a CPO Lao Che, because they're going to deal crazy AoE damage, which weakens your opponents, and in turn allows you to deal more damage back at less damage taken. So you want to be able to really pay as much attention as you can to the DPS March. Its location on the field is really important. You also maybe want it to be a little bit slower than your 2 other marches, which might sound weird, but it's so that when you enter a fight, it does enter a little bit later. So often people will just attack the first march they see, and then they'll be like, okay, I'm not really going to bother changing targets, and your DPS March can get as much value as possible. So you'll notice my Zulang has nothing really in terms of march speed. There's a few talents in here that have march speed, but it wasn't really deliberate. I was mainly going for the damage there. So you'll notice my DPS March will be a tad bit slower than my other commanders. It's not going to be as fast, and it's just there so that when it enters fights, it will just deal as much damage as possible. Also, with your DPS March or your damage March, whenever it throws its active skill off, if you're in a big open field situation where you're trying to do hit and run, really that's when you run. Once your DPS March gets the active skill off, it's time for you to dip. Don't get too greedy, because otherwise you could lose your main March and also lose a lot of the commanders that are supporting it. So, like I said, really quick to sum it up, your damage March is the main March. It gets the best equipment, the best commanders, and also it's going to be the whole thing you focus your Murderball on. Whenever your damage March gets low, you're going to go back to your city and refresh your Murderball. Whenever you throw your active skill with the damage March, it's probably time to retreat, especially in a big Murderball situation. The next March I recommend is your Tanky March, with a little bit of DPS behind it. This March is almost a secondary damage March, while also being a march that takes attention off your main damage march. And the commanders that really do this, you've got Henry, you've got, I would say, Sargon for infantry, and then cavalry honestly don't really have a very good commander who's meant to be very tanky. I mean, you've got Nevsky, he can be kind of tanky. Justinian is pretty tanky, and he's probably the main commander I would say here. And then you've also got commanders like Bertrand who are somewhat tanky. But really, I'd say for cavalry, your best tanky commander is probably Justinian. You'll notice really the rally commanders are your best tanking commanders. Also, Attila Takeda is a pretty good tanking march for you cav players. And this march is just there to take the heat off your other marches, because obviously the tank march is there to take hits. For example, Henry is probably the best archer commander in terms of being able to take damage and deal damage back. Not to mention he's got fairly high normal attack, which increases his counter attack. So Henry, he's an overall tanky commander, and he's obviously going to be your tanky march. And I recommend getting this march as your second march, because it is really the best march to support your damage march. Because instead of adding extra damage, which you'll see once we get to the third march, you are instead adding extra tankiness. And if this march is slightly faster than your DPS march, most people will just hit the tanky march because it's going to show up first, and it's like, alright, I'm just going to smash that. And even though it's a Henry, they might see the Zulang show up 1 or 2 seconds later. They've already attacked the Henry, and if they switch targets, they have to march to it. You get extra time to throw your active skills off, and stuff like that is really good. So your tanky march is there to take the heat off your main DPS march, and it's usually going to be your fastest march if possible. When you're running your tanky march, I also recommend putting a fairly good DPS commander behind it, just to make it a little bit more threatening, instead of just being a sit around and deal no damage but take a ton of damage march. Because then I would just say run a Constantine with a Richard, but obviously you still want to get fairly good trades out of that march. So you want to have a good DPS secondary to that march. For this, I really do recommend, for example, for archers of YSG or a Shobani Pal. For cavalry with your Justinian, you can actually put a Zhang Yu as a primary, possibly. You could also consider a commander like possibly, maybe even William for a march like this, or Chandragupta, who can do pretty good damage. And I think once Cavs once again get more commanders, this will change, and you'll notice you can just apply the new cavalry commanders to this, especially if there's another pretty good DPS cavalry. And then for infantry with your Sargon, who's probably going to be your main tank, you could also consider Tarek. I'd recommend putting a Guan behind that, because you're going to get A, pretty good support out of the silence right here, which makes it a lot more threatening, and B, you're going to be dealing a lot of damage to your opponent. So I would say your tanky march is really there to take the heat off your main march. With infantry, you could also consider running a Gorgo Lao Che, which can be not really tanky, but that can become your DPS march. And then you could run a CPO with a Sargon as your main tank march, because that march will actually be extremely tanky on the open field. So your tank march, it's going to be getting slightly worse trades than your DPS march. It's not going to be your main focus. And once you introduce your third march, it's going to be much less important. But it is still a very important march to have. And it should be the march that is the fastest and is able to take the most damage from your opponents. If you ever are in a situation where your Murderball gets caught out, so for example, if you're rocking 3 marches on the open field and all 3 marches are about to be caught out, you will sacrifice your tank march to save your Murderball. So for example, let's say I was running this Boudica, Zulang, and this Henry Murderball right here, and let's say my marches were getting absolutely shredded. I was just getting destroyed. I would recall my Boudica, I'd recall my Zulang, and I would run my Henry into the enemy's Murderball. So that way, yes, I am losing 1 march, but I am saving the other 2 marches, which are less tanky and won't get very good trades if they get swarmed down. And yes, Henry is probably still going to get a bad trade, but he will get a better trade than the other 2 marches. So your tanky march is there to distract your opponents, but even if it doesn't get hit, you still want it to deal pretty good damage, which is where you introduce pretty much 1 DPS commander. Obviously, sometimes this doesn't work if people are paying a lot more attention to your Murderball. Usually in 1v1s this can happen. You'll notice they'll ignore your tank march, which is why they might just go straight for your DPS march, but there isn't really a way to control that too well. So that's why you try and put a good DPS commander behind your tanking commanders to at least get a good trade, even if it does get ignored. Because I can say a Henry with a YSG is going to get crazy kills if it gets ignored, a Sargon with a Guan or a CPO is going to get really good kills if it gets ignored, and then even just a Justinian or an XY Justinian, if that gets ignored, is also going to notch a ton of kills as well. So you'll notice your tank march, it's kind of a hybrid between damage and also tankiness, but it's really there to alleviate pressure and alleviate the opponent's active skills off your main DPS march, which is still your focus at this point. Now, the third and final type of march you want your Murderball to have is a support march. This march will usually deal a good amount of DPS, but it's really there for the debuffs. It's there to increase the amount of damage you're dealing, and yes, it may not be a meta commander, but they've got really strong debuffs. Obviously, there are meta commanders with really good debuffs like Herman Prime and Zulang, but they're more DPS commanders in my opinion. One commander though that's a really good supporting commander is someone like Boudica Prime, where yes, she is somewhat tanky in her own regard, and if you're running a tank march with archers, you could actually consider her, but really you're there for that skill damage increase on her active skill. This is a crazy strong skill damage increase. It's going to make your single target skills pop off, it's going to make your AoEs deal more damage, and it's just all around really powerful. With your support march, you usually want to run, again, another fairly good DPS secondary, because if your other marches go down, or if your other marches are maybe not there in time, you're basically support march can still once again deal some pretty good damage. So really, with the structure of all your marches, with your tank march, it's one tanky commander and one DPS. With your support march, it's one support commander, one DPS. And with your damage march, it's two damage heavy commanders rather than adding like a tanky commander. It's just two really high damage commanders. So with support marches, you're there to deal not really as much damage as possible, but you're there to increase the damage of your other two marches and even the commander that is the secondary to your support commander. The main examples of this would probably include for archers, like I said, Boudica Prime. Cyrus is slightly an example here, and also Tamiris. And then you've also, I guess, also got Gilgamesh. There's a lot of supporting commanders in the game. And then for infantry, I'd say you've really got Guan Yu, who can be pretty supporting. And then you can also have a few other commanders, such as Sargon as well, who can be a support commander. I did forget to mention Pakal and Harold is a tank march, so if you do need that, you could consider running it if you already have those commanders. Also, commanders like Alexander the Great with Lao Che, even though it's almost a DPS march, I can say it's arguably in some ways a support march, because I'm pretty sure Alexander the Great has an all damage reduction somewhere in his kit that is fairly strong. So you'll notice that he actually has an all damage increase of 30%. So yes, Alexander the Great can be a really good supporting commander for infantry. So you'll notice that supporting commanders, yes, they may be slightly outdated, but they usually have a really good debuff, and they're usually not the tankiest, but they have some tankiness in their kit. So for example, Boudica is more tanky than Zulang, but she's not as tanky as a Henry, for example. And Alexander the Great is probably more tanky than someone like a Guan Yu, but he's definitely not as tanky as someone as like a Sargon or a Scipio, who can be way more tanky than him. For the cavalry commanders, your support commanders are really simple. You've got Hao Che Bing and you've got William. That's going to be your best support march for now. And even Joan Prime in some ways can be supporting, but I think she's more of a DPS commander with like a light touch of support on her active skill. But really, I think William is a very good example of the support commander that you'd be looking for if you're a Cav main. So really, your support march is meant to be slightly slower than your tanky march. You still want your tanky march to hit first, and it's going to be hopefully slightly quicker than your DPS march, especially within its rage cycle. So for example, I'd rather my Boudica have a faster rage cycle than my Zulang, so that Boudica can get her active skill off first, and then my Zulang can hit second, so he gets all the nice juicy skill damage increases that Boudica does give. So really, when you're looking at these commanders for the support march, they're only there to be the support with a little bit of DPS on the side, so that if you aren't getting full value from their supporting skills, you can at least get the value once again from the damaging commanders, who are going to just get a ton of kills on their own. If your tanky march does go down, then you are able to sacrifice your support march, because like I said, often with supporting commanders, they can be a little bit tanky. So Boudica Prime, she's way more tanky than a Zulang with a Herman. And then even commanders, like I said, Scipio from before can be tankier than someone like a Guan as an example, or a Lao Che. So your support march is your second in terms of sacrificing. So hopefully your DPS march, which can't take any damage, does get away when this march gets sacrificed. That's really the main thing I would recommend in order when you sacrifice. Tanky march first, supporting march second, and then try and get away with your DPS march at pretty much all costs, since it's going to get the worst trade if it does get swarmed down. So now, if you are looking to build your own Murderball, really all you have to do is ensure that you've got one very good DPS march, even if it's a Nebu YSG as an example, that can still be a DPS march. And then you want to ensure it's got a tanking march. Maybe that's something such as a Pakal and Harold, which I mentioned before, which is definitely a tanking march. And then your final thing you want is a support march. So maybe if you have a Guan and a Leo, this is a really bad Murderball overall. It's very outdated, but something like that is still going to be following that structure of what makes a good Murderball. And yes, obviously it's going to be a bit hard to include that when you get to 5 marches, but that's why I recommend 3 as the best position, because once you get to 5 marches, you have less access to commanders who are going to fulfill those roles, and you can get access to commanders like Trajan who knock off the whole other supporting marches, and it gets a little bit wacky. But you'll notice if you're following a 3 march structure mutable, your first march is going to be your DPS march. It's your main focus. Your second march is preferably your tanky march, or at least you're working towards it. So maybe you're making, let's say, an archer mutable. I'd recommend first march Zulang Herman, second march something like a Boudica with an Ashur Pal, and then a third march as a Henry YSG, and you're kind of working towards that, or a Boudica YSG, then you replace the Boudica with a Henry, and then you get a Ashur Pal and bring your Boudica back in, something like that would be how I'd recommend running that. And then your third march is your support march, so that's the best murderable structure in my opinion, and if you follow that, you'll pretty much always have a fairly solid murderable. It won't be too squishy, it won't be too tanky where it's not getting enough kills, it won't deal low damage, and it won't deal ridiculous damage to where if you get hit, you get annihilated. It will pretty much be in the middle and very reliable in every single situation. Now, if you enjoyed today's video, I want to ask you guys for a very small favor, and that is consider subscribing to the channel. I hope that today's video would be able to give you guys a little bit of an idea on how to build your own murderable rather than just following meta commanders, because obviously not everyone has access to the best of the best commanders. Maybe you're missing a few, you just have to try and make a judgment on which commanders are going to work with which role I told you today. So if you have DPS commanders, defense, whatever it may be, put them in that role, try and get them to work in that situation, and you'll pretty much always have a good murderable. Now, if you enjoyed today's video, like I said, do consider subscribing. It supports the channel massively. To anyone who just subscribed, a massive, massive thank you to you, and to all people that were subscribed before, a huge thank you to you as well. Now, I just want to say thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.